Hello and welcome to the Sharpening Report. We have a very special episode for you today. We have returning guest William Ramsey. He's got a new book out, Global Death Cult, The Order of Nine Angles, Atomwaffen, and the Slaughter of the Innocents. We welcome back to the show William Ramsey. William, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back, Josh. It's great to talk with you again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming back on. Your research is absolutely phenomenal, much needed. People will remember the last time that we had you on the show, we talked about things relating to silent cry, the darker side of trafficking. We dealt with a lot of the Satanism that's around the child sex trade, which you would think child sex trafficking is bad enough as it is, let alone putting Satanism on top of it. But that's unfortunately the world that we live in. And you bring to the table some brand new information. The first that I've ever heard of the Order of Nine Angles was during my research for Silent Cry. But at that time, there was such little known about it. People couldn't even get the name right. Everybody kept calling him Order of the Nine Angels. But there was such little known about it that well, I couldn't really get too far in the research, but now some time has passed, and your investigative skills have really shown up here. Where do we start? What first brought you into this topic as an investigator?
Well, I had a guest reach out to me. His name is Igor Sorsky, and he said, "Listen about this group," and I hadn't really heard about it. I had read about the kind of founder. His name was David Myatt back in after 2001. I remember reading about him in a blog called, from Rigorous Intuition, which was kind of like a conspiracy type blog. But I didn't really know that much. But Sarsky, we talked, and I was like, wow, this is really a fascinating subject. And I was always interested in the cult, as you know. So I really started reading more. And then I started seeing it pop up in the news. So I read about these cases of people, I include them in the book, Ethan Meltzer, William von Nudegem, who murdered somebody at night, and they were associated with the Order of Nine Angles. So that even piqued my interest even more. So I really wanted to find out what this whole group was about. And Crowley popped up, so I had already kind of knew a lot about Crowley. So this is group Order of Nine Angles would be a post-Crowley, post-Hitler type of group with a strange set of ideas, but they really surfaced for me, like if you look at the media and some of these far right-wing groups within really the last couple of years, and you'll see in my book, some of these people haven't even been affiliated with the Order of Nine Angles. They're sitting in jail, or they actually had a guy named Denton who got sentenced to 42 months in prison May 5th. So something very, very recent. So it's now in the news, and it started really as a very small group, really sending out manuscripts from a PO box in kind of a rural area of the UK, and just started to grow. And I gave the title of the book Global Death Cult because they have a very peculiar view of human sacrifice, and they're starting to spread throughout the world. So it started in the UK, but now their presence is in the United States, Canada, and there are small, very small groups in other nations throughout the world, at least the Western kind of nations.
Well, and like you said, too, this ended up connecting with a lot of your previous work. For those who aren't familiar with you or your work, how does this connect with your previous work, especially into secretive groups with these far-reaching plans to influence societies around the world?
Well, I think it very much ties in because you have these kind of groups, OTO, and maybe I've done a little bit of the Church of Satan, but this group definitely has long-term group. I mean, I don't think it's a very large group, but I think that their doctrines are very lethal. So I think that that's what sets them apart. And I would think, based upon their literature and what they've said, they want to be set apart from other versions of Satanism. So different than the OTO, Temple of Satan, and Temple of Set and Church of Satan. And there's actually an interesting interplay between who people suspect to be the founder of this group. It's very shadowy, and Michael Aquino from the Temple of Set, and how they're rationalizing their views of what true Satanism is. And that's the Satanic Letters of Stephen Brown. So I include that in the book. And I think it's very important because you can kind of see this interplay of these occult thinkers that really aren't public. And that's what's weird about this whole group, is that they just grew out of manuscripts pre-internet. But I think that the phenomenon has grown due to the internet, so the ability to exchange information. And this real small subgroup has had a much larger presence now.
Do you think that this is going to grow? And does this secretive group have plans to influence societies around the world?
Yeah, so I think one of their central tenets or doctrines is to engage in insight roles to fulfill their goals of what they would call a dark imperium. The group came out of right wing, far right National Socialism politics, so very right wing racist views. And I think that they were frustrated with not having, at least the founder was frustrated with not having a real political success. So this occult avenue is kind of an end around to try to achieve those successes. Whether that's actually feasible, their ideas are 300 years from now, they're going to have a dark imperium that has all of these kind of ideas from Hitler and National Socialism in this group. So they have a kind of like almost a restated view towards other people, like an Untermenschen or subhuman. They call them mundanes. And their view is that if they don't pass certain tests based upon what they think, they can be cold, which is their kind of term for human sacrifice. But you're not supposed to get caught. So it's not like what you would term as kind of like maybe in a person's mind of like a ritual of somebody to be sacrificed on an altar. It would be something very surreptitious, and if they succeeded, that this person who did it would never be caught. So it's very sinister, and they actually call themselves kind of partakers of the sinister tradition is kind of like a theme in that. But they supposedly have these long-term goals, but they don't have the numbers, I think, that would really have anything close to what happened in Germany under the Nazis in the 30s and 40s.
But you bring up a good point, though. Even though their numbers are small now, it's something that we should be talking about and exposing, because if you can expose this stuff when the movement is small, hopefully, they can prevent them from growing underground under everybody's noses.
Well, that's a great point. But here's the thing is, like, now it's in the public. In 2020, 2021, what have they been doing for the last 25 years?
Right.
Since these doctrines have been going out. So you kind of have to walk it back and go, what have they gotten away with? I don't have any evidence of crimes other than what's in the book. But if you read through all their literature, there's almost 10,000 pages of ONA literature. There's actually a book called The Big Book of ONA Literature you can download if somebody really wants to go through it. But they have this kind of learning, almost like an Aesop's fable, learning fiction, where you learn to do things. But there's always this emphasis of going out at night, of like a sinister group. So they call themselves a sinister tribe. They're above the law, and they are into the occult. So it's almost like what's going on in these groups and what are they doing at night. So it's not like in a person's mind they'll see like a Nazi documentary and see guys with swastikas in a military, or something. This is something different, but very similar to me, very similar to the Nazi ideology. And they time, so like we say AD or Common Era, somebody else will say they use YF in all of the real believers use YF, Eurifying, which is Year of Rejoicing, which is 1889, the birth of Adolf Hitler. So it is esoteric Nazism, but it's a very vicious strain of that. And there have been esoteric Nazis who don't look at Hitler like an antichrist. I look at Hitler like an antichrist, but they see him as an avatar. And I think that this group sees Hitler as an atavistic person. I mean, which is really amazing when you consider all of the misery and suffering that happened in World War II and how many millions of people died.
Yeah, absolutely. And how can this group, the Order of Nine Angles, or ONA for short, be actually traced from the British neo-Nazi movement to a series of transnational cells with a global reach now?
That's a great question. So they came out, so you have this intelligent person, David Myatt, who may or may be just a front for other thinkers, but he is structuring this group, but he calls his, like maybe a terrorist group would call it a cell or something, but they use the term Nexians. So you'd have this groups. And so his conception was that was the way that this group would grow, as little seedlings throughout the world. They would call them Nexians. Maybe as somebody in the law enforcement would call them like a cell. But they have these little seedlings all in kind of groups. Maybe it would be the same as like the OTO has its oases and little segments. They have their own seeded throughout the world. So that's really it. But they also have this concept of insight roles. So to gain influence and infiltrate, you go to do something to gain that experience. So a lot of these guys will try to join the military. They're in the military. National Guard, or try to get some kind of skill set. And that was kind of like, there's been other researchers into the far right looking at these guys from a political angle, but my angle is looking at more as like the occult angle, because I have some people in this book who were clearly occultists, in my opinion, prior to joining the far right movement. So their involvement in the far right is more from an occult perspective than being from a political perspective, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So that's really the concern.
Oh no, I was just saying, yeah, that makes sense, and just so people are familiar with the terms here, because we live in this crazy culture where nobody can agree on definitions anymore, and the term far right is usually in the media, it's thrown out at anybody who has even slightly conservative leanings. So when we're talking about far right, how would you define far right?
I would say kind of like in the National Socialistic vein. I mean, not the white supremacy that comes from the left today, but actual real kind of an ethnocentric, but really fevered kind of view.
Yeah.
And so I think Adam Waffen, which I include in the title, is really one of those groups that really only started in the U.S. in 2015, but some of its members have been arrested within the last couple of years. And that's a whole nother segment. And within that group, there was a battle between really the National Socialists and the occulted National Socialists for kind of a battle for ideology. And that's what's kind of seeped out. But, I mean, these are actual real far rightists. These are not like in the political discourse of rhetoric. You know, the definition is, I think, really accurate that these are really far rightist occultists.
Absolutely.
Much like the Nazis. I mean, you can go back through Nazi history and you'll see these guys are very serious occultists. I mean, I think Himmler for sure is known. Hitler not so much, but his outlook was definitely very similar to the ONA outlook, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did this group, the ONA, how did they, and the formation began with a small group in England. How did they grow to international prominence?
Right. Well, that's a great question. So you're constantly sending out these manuscripts. The manuscripts decompressed, and then they became books. And so then people could access those books. There were Naos, the Black Book of Satan. So there's external and internal rituals, things you do for yourself. And then external is like being with other people. But that slowly kind of grew, almost like an avalanche, like a small snowball rolling down and picking up adherents and growing. And then other leaders would come in and continue down recruitment and things like that. And the researchers have researched this group, like I said, very small, 1 to 2,000. But I think that really, once the internet really became, much more accessible, mid-90s, I think that's how this group really was able to attract more and more adherents and really become a global in stature. I suspect it probably wasn't anticipated by even the founders that they would have this means of communication that would seed these ideas all throughout the world. But that's really it. So then you have this term Nexian, which they use. I mean, from their perspective, that's almost like a spiritual group of these practitioners that they would term, like we would say we have a temporal or spiritual world. They would say causal and acausal. And so they're trying to draw down this acausal thing to themselves. Their ideas are really kind of the dark gods. They have 21 dark gods. So their version of Satanism is not what would be traditional Satanism, what that person would think about, like Anton LaVey or Michael Aquino or Crowley. So they want, their ideas is not just this dark Imperium, but they want to bring these kind of dark gods into our plane of existence. And that's a common theme in there. And if you read through my book, I just have a section where they talk about the dark gods. They acknowledge that their views are very similar to Lovecraft's kind of dark gods, but I think that they would have that kind of similar perception of these beings as being kind of like dark entities that they want to re-presence on the earth.
Strange. You mentioned the name David Myatt. Who is David Myatt, and what is his connection to the ONA?
So that, I mean, there's different real figures who have written under pseudonyms. One is Anton Long, Stephen Brown, but David Myatt is a known figure in far-right politics, and he's written his own biography, and he actually has his own biographer, so he's influential enough to have somebody write his own biography, but it's believed that he is using these pseudonyms to protect himself. And so in the section that I talked about earlier, the satanic letters of Stephen Brown, people who've met Myatt say, hey, you look exactly like Stephen Brown and you look like Anton Long. And he didn't deny it. He just said, I have to do this to protect my professional career, which makes sense. Mm. So Myatt, I think, is really kind of, to me, the core person in this whole group who is the real brains, person of high intelligence, and has really kind of structured it. And he comes out of, and he writes about how he came out of the far right. I think it was the National Front in Britain. So he was with, and I include this in my book, I include all these figures from the farthest right in Britain that he was either a bodyguard for or was around. And these guys, there were brawls, and they just actually had a documentary on Netflix called The London Nail Bomber. And this was a guy by the name of David Copeland. This is a huge event in the UK where a not literal National Socialist, a self-admitted Nazi, went to London and dropped 3 bombs within 2 weeks. Every weekend he was dropping it and injured hundreds of people. People lost their legs. People died. So very serious event. But this guy was part of what they go through, different iterations of changing the names of the group once they come under pressure. But the National Socialist movement in Britain, Copeland was apparently involved in, and Myatt was the head of that at the time. Mm. So you can see this Nazi pedigree of this group, and its outlook is Nazistic. And it's interesting because Myatt was mixing in these post-war groups, and he actually knew Otto Raymer. For people who are World War II history buffs, when von Stauffenberg did what's known as like the Valkyrie, try to overthrow the government in 1944 of Germany and try to bomb Hitler at the Wolf's Lair, Otto Raymer was a very important part of the counter coup, who actually shut down the coup and had all the, not had, but all the plotters eventually got shot. Well, Myatt knew Raymer and considered an autographed copy of one of his works as like his greatest thing. So it's really incredible, these connections back to Nazi Germany. So Otto Raymer is known, and you can look him up on Wikipedia. He's involved in post-war fascist politics. These guys did not change their stripes after the World War II. A lot of them didn't.
Wow. Another name that comes up too is Michael Aquino. Who is he? What is the Temple of Set, and what is Myatt's relationship to Michael Aquino?
Right. So then it goes back to these satanic letters of Stephen Brown, which is a communication between this person who is Stephen Brown, but I believe that is Myatt, and the Temple of Set, including Michael Aquino, and I include a signed missive from Aquino back to Myatt. So these guys are comparing, to me, they're almost comparing notes. And Myatt is or whoever's writing that, Stephen Brown, they're very knowledgeable about the Temple of Set, and they make this differentiation in their outlook between their group and the Temple of Set. And Aquino was a person who, I think he was originally a member of the Church of Satan with LaVey, and then he started an offshoot called the Temple of Set, and he had some works. But he was actually, Aquino was known in the government. He was a psychological operations officer in the U.S. government. You can see pictures of him in his military uniform. So he's a very dark operative. And also he had a fascination with Nazism. These guys who are Satanists have this, and there's a picture I include in my book of Aquino holding an SS blade, like a military blade. So these guys, a lot of these occult, it's hard to say how much of the occult is in the Nazism, but there's a lot there, and a lot what these occultists are interested in the Nazi view. And actually Myatt himself said that Nazism was a perfect application of satanic principles. So I think he even acknowledges that of the Nazi group. Sorry, but if you look at this part of my book, this chapter, I think it's very interesting because they're it shows their outlook and what their intent is for when they're using or actually practicing Satanism.
It's amazing how much this worldview has pervaded since World War II, and really in a lot of ways has grown. We definitely have a lot more to talk about. I want to get into, what this has to do with Christians. Why Christians really need to know what this group thinks of us, because that's really important too, especially if it's growing. We got to talk about some more of the darker elements like human sacrifice and stuff. But before we do, William, if people want to get this book or follow your work, check out your movies, where can they go?
My book, my website is William Ramsey Investigates. You can get a signed copy there. I have a Kindle and softbound copies are on Amazon right now. My films are on um, on Vimeo, so you can check that out. But yeah, this yeah, turns out they have a very strong like all these satanic groups, very strong anti-Christian animus, and they call Christians Nazarenes and Magians. So it's almost like this. They're against the Judeo-Christian worldview and political structure, really.
Mm. And yeah, well, we've definitely only scratched the surface. We're going to head into topics now that if we did put on YouTube, they get deleted immediately. So for everybody watching, we are going to make this full interview available at dailyrenegade.com. Make sure you head on over there and get a membership or try us out with a free 7-day trial. So there's no excuse to miss the rest of this interview, and check out the rest of the show with William Ramsey and so much more. So members, hang on the line. Everybody else, take care and God bless.